Well, good morning. We are talking about the topic, as you can see on screen at the moment, the God who saves. We're going to look at Exodus 11 to 12. This is the period when the final plague, the death of the firstborns, was unleashed on the Egyptians and not on the Israelites because of the Passover, because of the sprinkling of the blood of the lamb over the doorpost. So this Passover was an absolutely momentous event. It's a fundamental belief to Christianity, of course. In the midst of judgment, the Lord saves his people through sacrifice's blood. And Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, was the sacrificial lamb in the case that we're talking about. But in this case here, it's to do with the first Passover. And the point is that everybody who took refuge under the blood of the Lamb was saved from God's judgment. And I noted when I read this that God's active role in this, he said that he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down in Exodus 12 verse 23. This is God stopping something happening, for the Israelites at least. And the Passover was a very, very important event as far as God could see, because it's the start. He wanted at the start of each year. He wanted new life, spring, and in our case also Easter, and the Passover to be at the start of the year. This is when everything is looking forward and is new. Another point that came out about this fundamental belief, what is very often mentioned in the New Testament, absolutely underpins, is fulfilled in the New Testament, and is referred to many, many times. So of course the Passover, momentous event as it was a terror for Egypt, but its release for Israel. Not even the Pharaoh escapes the death of his firstborn son. And the Israelites are moved from poverty to riches, from slavery to riches. This release is not just dumping on the doorstep of the prison. This is with a blessing. And without a threat. With all the threats and all the things that have been going on, this was without a threat. Not even a dog will bark at the Israelites. That's saying something in the land of pets, where we have dogs all around us every day. And I guess there are a few dogs back in ancient Egypt. Not even a dog will bark at them. And it was momentous as well because this is the start of Israel as a nation. It's a defining moment. And it's a case of belonging. No foreigner was allowed to eat the Passover meal unless they were circumcised. This is the beginning, the coalescing of Israel as a nation through this one event. Now this got me wondering, this is about the 10th plague, got me wondering if you could remember any of the other plagues or the order they're in. And I must confess, I need a prompt. So we've got water to blood, and then the frogs and the lice or the gnats, wild animals, pestilence of livestock, boils, etc., leading through to the death of the firstborn. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at the behaviour of some of the different parties involved in this Passover. Got to remember we've had the 9 plagues. A final, more deadly plague is threatened, is foretold. Death of every firstborn. Every level in society, Pharaoh down to slave girl. But 10 times Pharaoh says no. It's a lot of no's, isn't it? It's a long process to try and persuade people. There were many opportunities to avoid the worst of God's anger, which were ignored. And really only a fool could not acknowledge the difference between the outcomes of the plagues for the Egyptians and for the Israelites. There was clearly something out of balance here. Only a fool could not acknowledge it. Everyone noticed it, but it's acknowledging it that makes a difference. And Moses' predictions were right every time. What Moses said happened. And when Pharaoh was told his son was next, he chose to ignore. It's not that he didn't understand, he wouldn't listen. His heart was hardened. God hardened his heart, he says, so that my wonders will multiply. Far-reaching consequences for his behaviour. And Jesus the same. In Mark 3 verse 5, when he healed on the Sabbath, he had an argument with the Pharisees who were only trying to catch him out. And Jesus made the wonderful comment, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Surely hearts were hardened. And yet afterwards, with death was upon them, Pharaoh does not take long to agree that the Israelites must leave with all their possessions, with all their livestock, meeting all the conditions of the Israelites. I imagine it probably was minutes after his firstborn son dies that Pharaoh summoned Moses. It was still night. And interesting, just before, Pharaoh's threat was, the day you see my face, you will die. That was his threat to Moses. And instead it became, the day my son dies, I need to see your face to ask you to leave. We have to be careful what we wish for, don't we? And really, he had always understood. It's just now he was willing. How sad is that? He was also scared. Pharaoh knew who was in charge, the Israelites' God was. He and his people were now in fear of their own lives. Well, a bit late for that, wasn't it? And he says to Moses, in a rather sad epitaph, also bless me, and also bless me. And then even then, his change in mind was temporary. He changed his mind before they crossed the Red Sea, set out after them, and we know the result of that story. So what about Moses? No doubt a lot has been written about Moses over the years. Moses strikes me as having very practical behaviour. In the 9th plague, he was arguing with Pharaoh about not taking the animals with them. And he says in Exodus 10, verse 26, until we get there, we don't know what we will use to worship God. So we've got to take it all with us. Effectively what he's saying. It struck me the best leaders are very practical, as well as able to see the big picture, etc. And I find this fascinating. Moses was still highly regarded by Egyptian officials and by the Egyptian people. After all that he had been a channel for, all these plagues, everything, the fear, what have you, he was still high regarded by the Egyptians, both part of the regime, as we like to say these days, and part of the populace. And finally, he gets exasperated with Pharaoh. His last encounter, he leaves Pharaoh hot with anger. Pharaoh is still not paying attention. How often do we come across the same problem? We still can't get people's attention. And Moses was grieved by the hardness of the Pharaoh's heart. He was deep grief, hot with anger as it's described here. So let's examine some aspects of this. First of all, the plague of death of the firstborn. Well, the first thing is, there was no lack of warning. This plague was the first one to be threatened, but the last one to be enacted. Even the time of this plague was foretold at midnight. And God says the wailing will be the worst ever. Now, if God says that, that's a big deal. If we think of all the wailing in the world that's ever been, all the disaster, etc., God's saying, this is going to be the worst. This night of the plague of the firstborn. And indeed, all the Egyptians were stirred during the night when it happened. So before, it affected the high and the low, the pharaoh and the servant girl. Sometimes it has to get personal before you properly understand. And in a statement that I'd missed before, God also brought judgment on all the gods of Egypt. So the Egyptians' life and their way of life was totally ended, totally dissembled, totally taken apart. And as an interesting sideline, it was interesting that Moses and Aaron Moses and Aaron, his mouthpiece, were really the people that instigated the previous plagues. Not so this time. This was God's work. This was God intervening. And what a fearful thing that was. So while this terrible plague was happening to the Egyptians, there was protection for Israel. Israel were saved from that fate. And there's a few points here, and then I want to try and expand some of these a bit more. First of all, the Passover lamb or kid, because it could be a lamb or it could be a sheep or a goat, was a substitute. It was not just a substitute in meaning, but it provided actual protection. The angel passed over, literally, the houses where the blood of the lamb was on the door, on the lintel and on the sides. The blood of the innocents brings safety here for the protection of Israel. So say the Passover itself, the meal itself, it could be a lamb or a kid, it could be either sheep or a goat. I hadn't realised that before, but it's very plain in Exodus. It could be spread across more than one household, depending on what people could eat. Again, very practical sort of measure. It was echoes really of where two or three are gathered together, because it would be eaten in one house, but it could be more than one household in order that it would all be consumed. It was eaten in haste. It was supposed to be, it was reflecting the fact that they were about to move at the first Passover. So it was basically quickly made, it was unleavened bread. It was roasted, the lamb was roasted, no water was required. It was to be consumed quickly, which is a bit opposite to what our parents taught us, eat slowly. And the bitter herbs were there to remind the eaters that this was all to do with the slavery, ending slavery. It all had to be consumed on the night or burnt. None could be kept. And there were rules about participation. All those must be circumcised, i.e. fully committed to the nation of Israel. No foreigner or temporary worker or hard worker. And he says at the end of Exodus 12, one law for both the native born and the alien. The flip side of that is, if everybody is circumcised, then they are welcome, and it's one law for everybody. Spent some time going through Matthew Henry's commentary on the Bible and tried to pick out from some of the things he said about the meaning of the Passover for us. The meaning of the lamb, the meaning of the blood, and the meaning for our Christian lives. And I thought there were some really interesting things in here. That the lamb is innocent and meek, just like Christ. In his prime, without blemish. He makes the point that they're slain by many. Many have to slay the individual lambs or kids. But also Christ was slain by many. And no bone was broken in either Christ's body or should be broken in the Passover lamb. And the blood, the meaning of the blood. The blood is not just shed, it's not just spilt, but it must be sprinkled in many places. is displayed publicly on the doorpost and lintel, top of the door. Not on the bottom of the door, because that's not respectful, but on the sides and on the top of the door. And the decision to use the blood on the door to create the fact the angel will pass over was a decision by the occupants themselves. It's for us to deploy the blood, if you like. And there's some meanings also for our Christian lives. The lamb was to be fed on, was to be consumed, completely taken on board. And it was to be consumed completely. And it was to be consumed completely and immediately, not left until the morning. Eating with bitter herbs, as we said, reminders of sorrow and brokenness, of slavery. Sometimes maybe we look for the sweet things in life. This is a reminder of some of the bitter things. Eaten ready to travel, leaving sin behind. The bread unleavened, i.e. without further sin. A lasting, repeating commitment. Keep feasting and doing it. Remembering God is at the centre of everything, even crises. So after the plague of the firstborn, and the Israelites have consumed their Passover meal, and the Passover blood, lamb's blood, has been on the door, and the angels have not touched the Israelites. We have the Exodus. And when we say Exodus, we mean Exodus. We've heard of huge movements of people, but this was probably, say, 600,000 men. Well, Matthew Henry said, well, probably at least 600,000 women and children, yes, but they're also hangers-on. Suddenly, this huge body of people, there's more than 1 million people, suddenly are on the move, on foot, within hours. Probably the biggest ever movement of people in such a short space of time. And I think you can include world wars and Syria and all kinds of things like that. Within a few hours, these people were moving. And there's a vast increase also from the 70 people that came to Egypt to Joseph. If you remember that, back in Genesis 46. And I can't find a comparative figure for the number of people that are in Britain that time. And the flippant answer is there's probably enough people to build Stonehenge. So there have been a few thousands, no doubt. But this is 1 million people on the move. And this massive exodus, well, they left in haste. They say that the bread was half made. And it was in the troughs, covered with cloth. And here's the interesting thing, that the Egyptians pretty much helped them pack. Yeah? Part of the promise that God made was if the Israelites asked, the Egyptians would now give them things just to be shot of the Israelites, just to send them on their way. And the Israelites asked for silver, gold, and clothing. They already had food. And overnight, the slaves became richer than their cruel masters. And of course, you can argue that this is the first time the Egyptians treated the Israelites with respect. A bit late. It struck me that we should remember that God is in control of who gets what. And it says, lastly, many others went with them. And the doors were open, on God's terms, but open nonetheless. Matthew Henry describes them probably a rude, unthinking mob. Clearly a whole spectrum of all kinds of people. We talk about foreigners and temporary workers and all those sorts of things. But yes, massive exodus, sent on their way willingly by the Egyptians. A huge turnaround. So what can we learn from this? What are the observations and the conclusions we can draw from this? Well, first of all, I think food can be at the centre of almost any crisis. I see that this lockdown that we're in at the moment is a little bit like Passover, actually. We can't go out until morning. We're not quite sure when morning is, but they couldn't go out. because of the fact they were staying under the protection of the Passover blood on the door frame. And interestingly, in this whole Passover, this whole preparation, slaying of the lamb, there's a phrase that really strikes you between the eyes. The Israelites did exactly what the Lord commanded. Well, there's a change. There's a first and a last time, eh? What a shame that they only obey in a crisis. And the Israelites, as I say, they treated the Egyptians treated the Israelites with respect at last, but only after they'd experienced the destructive power for themselves. Let's not forget, in Moses' time, when he was a baby, they were killing young Hebrew children. And a point that came out through all of this, it says about, well, explain to your children about what the Passover means. It says somewhere in Exodus 12. It is right to be clear about the meaning of our faith, and also to ask about it. So from what do we draw as conclusions for the last slide from all of this? Well, the destroying angel passed over only because of the blood, not because of any absence of sin. It is essential that we recognize our forgiveness, but this is because of the blood. We are forgiven by grace alone. There is no condemnation now. The cross is similarly defining a moment in the Christian's life. There is no condemnation because of the blood of Jesus. And God hardened Pharaoh's hearts against the Israelites. Spirit of stupor, Paul calls it in Romans 11. And so the hardened heart is a really dangerous thing. Finally, the wrath of God is a terrible thing. We need to tremble before God. Amen.